The following is a presentation from TNTP. If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact us by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can find us online at www.tntp.org or on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Now, please enjoy the session.
Welcome to session 2 in our Science of Reading series. Today's session will zoom in on knowledge and vocabulary. Our goal today is that anyone participating will continue to explore what cognitive science tells us about how students learn to read. In particular, today we want you to be able to walk away with understanding the value of exposing young students to complex content and ideas, understanding the role that content knowledge plays in reading comprehension, how word learning is most efficient when students understand context, and how leveled reading can create inequities. So we'll start off by zooming into knowledge building and equity. In our first session a couple of weeks ago, we focused on word recognition, specifically phonological awareness and phonics. Today, we'll focus on the top part of Scarborough's rope, language comprehension. These components listed in the rope work together and braid together as our brains comprehend language, but there is one component that is the heaviest hitting of all of these components. Which one do you think that is? You probably guessed it. The heaviest hitting component is knowledge. This is because it influences all the other parts of the rope, especially vocabulary, and is the baseline for all the others. So to kick us off, we're going to take a moment to reflect on this excerpt from an article written by Natalie Wexler titled, "Elementary Education Has Gone Terribly Wrong." Natalie writes, "What if the medicine we have been prescribing is only making matters worse, particularly for poor children? What if the best way to boost reading comprehension is not to drill kids on discrete skills, but to teach them as early as possible the very things we've marginalized, including history, science, and other content that could build the knowledge and vocabulary they need to understand both written texts and the world around them?" Take a moment to think on this quote. Why might making the shift to building knowledge be so important? And why can it be such a difficult shift for district schools and teachers to make? Pause this video to jot down some reflections you have about these questions. So one of the key ideas we want to stamp today is that the effect of knowledge on reading comprehension is pretty strong. How big is it exactly? A student's general cultural knowledge correlates about 0.5 with reading comprehension test scores. And in this case, 1.0 is a perfect correlation. So this 0.5 correlation is about the same as the correlation between parents' heights and their kids' heights. So that just goes to show that that knowledge really does influence kids' reading comprehension. And we're going to see several more examples of that throughout this session. Before we jump into more research, we're going to briefly pause and discuss what we actually mean when we talk about knowledge building through text. So you'll pause this presentation for a few minutes to read through this particular case study from TNTP around a second grade classroom where knowledge has been prioritized. As you're reading, make note about what are your first impressions of this classroom, thinking particularly about the fact that it's a second grade classroom. What are students learning and who is engaged in that learning? And then how are second graders able to tackle complex texts and ideas? So go ahead and pause this video to take as much time as you need to read this case study, be reflecting on these questions, and ideally have someone with you to chat about these questions with. So some of the things you may have noticed and pulled out from this case study is that students are really engaged in this lesson. They're excited about what they're learning. They're using academic vocabulary in their discussions, and they have a lot to say about what they're learning about, what they're reading, and they're able to build on each other's ideas. And all students are on an equal playing field in terms of their discussion and kind of understanding and reading. They're pulling out ideas and connecting them to what they've already learned. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a parent of one of these students. Over dinner, you ask, "What did you do in English today?" What do you think your student would tell you? You'd probably open up a discussion about all kinds of exciting things, historical things that your second grader has learned in class. Now contrast that with a student whose class focused on reading skills as opposed to building knowledge. I know I've never heard of a student who came home excited to share that they learned to find the main idea in class. That's not what gets kids excited about reading and learning. So when we talk about building knowledge through text, we're talking about students engaging in complex texts about meaningful topics. We'll get into the cognitive science behind building knowledge and reading comprehension in just a moment, but I wanted to ground us in what impact this kind of classroom can have on a student. Does building knowledge and vocabulary through text improve students' reading and achievement? Absolutely. But it's also just an engaging and exciting way to teach. It gets students excited about coming to school every day, and it builds their confidence. So we've known that knowledge plays a role in reading comprehension for years. It's why every literacy textbook includes at least a small section on building quote-unquote background knowledge, and why as many high school English teachers were misguidedly taught that they needed to spend a ton of time teaching their students about the Renaissance and the Globe Theater in order to teach Romeo and Juliet. What's been unclear, though, is how and why knowledge is tied to comprehension. In 1988, researchers Recht and Leslie sought to dig into how much comprehension was impacted by knowledge by comparing the relative impact of reading ability to the impact of knowledge of a topic. They had students read a passage about baseball and then tested students' comprehension of that passage. They had 7th and 8th grade students read a short text about baseball and then tested them for comprehension using verbal retelling, reenactment with figurines, verbal summary, and rating ideas from the story in terms of importance. Students were then grouped according to reading ability and their knowledge of baseball. The 4 groups were what you see on this slide. Low reading ability, but high knowledge about baseball. Low reading ability and low knowledge about baseball. High reading ability and high knowledge about baseball. And finally, high reading ability, but low knowledge about baseball. So I want you to pause for a second and just think about how would you order these groups in terms of who you would predict comprehended the most about the text and why. So which of these 4 groups would you expect to deeply understand this text about baseball? So what this study actually revealed was that knowledge about baseball mattered far more than reading ability. With sufficient prior knowledge, the quote-unquote low ability students performed similarly to the higher ability students. The difference in their performance was not statistically significant. Similarly, there was little difference in the performance of the two low knowledge groups. This is why knowledge and content are considered one of the most important shifts in how we teach literacy. Content really does matter. So what does this mean for our practice as literacy teachers and coaches? Teaching content is teaching reading. Selecting texts that build students' knowledge of the world is crucial. How much time do you think is spent in a third grade classroom teaching social studies typically? It's about 5%. The sciences, another 5%. ELA, about 47%, almost half the day. Where does that time go? In the past, it's been on reading strategies, like finding the main idea, activating prior knowledge, etc. Experiments show these reading strategies help, but they're a one-time boost. Choose content that teaches students about the world and increases their general knowledge. That will have a bigger impact on comprehension than teaching reading strategies alone. So the baseball study has been replicated many times over on many different topics. And as the research has evolved, it's become clear that a student's socioeconomic background has a large bearing on the knowledge that they come to school with. In 2014, some researchers devised a study that looked at how the effects of knowledge on comprehension play out in different socioeconomic groups. They first tested low SES and middle to high SES preschool students on their knowledge of birds and found significant differences in knowledge between the two groups. Students that were more affluent had greater basic knowledge of birds. Unsurprisingly, when those students were given texts about birds and tested on their comprehension, the more affluent students performed better on those comprehension tests. Next, researchers read a series of books on 4 species of made-up creatures called wugs to control for background knowledge. So no group of students was walking into this reading passage with any basic knowledge of wugs, since wugs don't exist. They were reading something that's fictional. When tested for reading comprehension in these texts, the differences in comprehension between lower and higher socioeconomic groups disappeared. The driving idea here is that if we level the playing field when it comes to knowledge, we can also level the gaps we see in comprehension. So, why does this work? It's all about cognitive science. Cognitive scientist Dan Willingham from the University of Virginia has written extensively on the role of background knowledge and skill instruction in reading comprehension. In his article, How Knowledge Helps, he outlines the ways in which building knowledge supports comprehension. First, writers assume background knowledge. Consider the following. John's face fell as he looked down at his protruding belly. The invitation specified black tie, and he hadn't worn his tux since his own wedding 20 years earlier. What do you think is going on in this passage? Take a second to think about it. You were probably able to infer that John's worried that he'd gained weight and wouldn't fit into his tux without much conscious thought. You probably didn't have to sit there and ponder, let's see, why would the author tell me about the last time he wore a tuxedo? And likewise, the author didn't have to spell out for you all of the information, which would make reading quite tedious. You don't have to make inferences consciously because your knowledge helps you access all of the ideas associated with the words on the page. When you read tux, the cognitive processes that are making sense of the text can access not just a formal suit of clothing, but all of the related concepts in your memory. Tuxedos are expensive, they're not worn very frequently, they're not comfortable, they can be rented, they're often worn at weddings, and so on. As the text illustrates, the cognitive processes that extract meaning also have access to concepts represented by the intersection of ideas. Tux makes available to us clothing, and 20 years after wedding makes available to us gaining weight. The intersection of clothing and gaining weight yields the idea that clothing won't fit, and we understand why John is not happy. Readers also need to use conscious processing to resolve ambiguity at times. For example, let's say you encountered the following passage in the same text. John walked down the steps with care. Janine looked him up and down while she waited. Finally, she said, "Well, I'm glad I've got some fish in my purse." While you automatically inferred what was happening in the first passage, this one might make you stop and think. Why would she have fish in her purse? What's going on here? In that pause, you might consciously think about some of the more obscure associations of tuxes and events. You might get that sometimes we liken wearing a tux to looking like a penguin. Even if you didn't get it yourself, if I simply reminded you of that notion, the passage now immediately makes sense. So in addition to helping readers make inferences and build references for comprehension, knowledge also helps readers free up space in their working memory. The larger your knowledge base, the more easily you're able to chunk information. So let's do a quick experiment to see what this looks and feels like. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to read a word and remember as many as you can. Okay, now let's try this one more time. Same thing. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to read another word list and remember as many as you can. Which list 1 or list 2, were you able to remember more of after just 10 seconds? And why do you think that might be? Take a moment to reflect on that. There are 15 words on the first list, and most people can remember about 7 of them, because that is how many pieces of information our working memories can hold at one time. The second list is 16 letters long, but chances are you remembered more of them than you did in the first list because your knowledge base allowed you to treat the letters as chunks, holding more information in your working memory at a time. CNN, CBS, FBI, CIA, NCAA, these are all a series of letters that most of us are quite familiar with. So we've kind of chunked that together and it frees up a lot of working memory in our brains. So pause this video to reflect on this question for a moment. What are the implications of this on reading and storing and processing information? Knowledge builds schema. Readers who have more general knowledge are more likely to be able to chunk information they come across because they can hold more information in their working memory through chunking. They can read more without having to stop and reread parts of text, etc. These associations that help us make inferences, resolve ambiguity, and chunk information are known as our schema. Knowledge and schemas are like a spider's web. An actual web that has more connections and links will be much stronger than a web with fewer and will do a better job at catching bugs. The web that has very few attachments is more likely to break and simply doesn't have the same ability to trap any bugs that may fly into it. Knowledge and schemas are the same. Any topic that you've built a strong schema around is much more likely to catch similar applicable knowledge. For instance, if high school students read a text on operant conditioning, those students who have trained their dogs are going to be able to more quickly pick up the information than those who haven't. The former already have a schema formed around this information, and their mental spiderweb is well formed and ready to catch related subject matter. The latter lack the ability to be able to relate the material to anything recognizable. Their web is either non-existent or less intricate with its design. which may result in a starving spider and the inability to retain information. So another key idea I want to drive home is around when our K2 students get to high school. When our kiddos get to high school, many of them are likely to take the ACT. The reading section of the ACT includes 4 different types of passages with 10 questions each, for a total of 40 questions. How much time do you think students should have to read 4 passages and answer 40 questions? The reality is that the ACT gives them 35 minutes total. That means students must be able to read and understand passages very quickly, which is only possible if they have more general knowledge and can chunk information. And that same idea is true for many of the AP exams students will take. The AP World and US History exams, for example, are paced at about 1 minute per question, with every single question tied to a passage or other kind of stimulus. So we are not setting our students up for future success in high school and beyond if we don't begin with knowledge building in the earliest grades. So let's pause here for a second to reflect on all of the research and examples that we've talked about so far. I'd love for you to just pause the video for a couple of minutes and just jot down your thoughts on, based on what you've learned so far, what's the connection between knowledge building and equity? We'll now move on to discussing academic vocabulary. We named several of the impacts of knowledge on reading comprehension, but we missed a critical one. The most potent effect that knowledge has on reading comprehension is its relationship to vocabulary. Just like building background knowledge is known to be critical to students' reading comprehension, vocabulary is known to be a critical factor in students' academic achievement. Take a moment to read the text on this slide. This comes from the standards themselves. This calls our attention to the importance of vocabulary. So how does vocabulary influence comprehension? Let's take a few moments to put ourselves in a student's shoes and experience what reading is like without a strong vocabulary base. I'm going to read this passage out loud to you, and then you'll pause the video to consider the questions down at the bottom. What do you learn about Eliza from this paragraph? What is special about the book Eliza wrote? And what's the main idea of the passage? Here we go. When she was 26, Eliza bought tickets to few had ever been there. Eliza wrote for the back home. She loved sharing the things she saw, such as, Eliza even wrote a book, the first about when Eliza went back to, it wasn't long before she started thinking about again. She decided to visit her older brother, who was working in Eliza across the ocean. So what's the main idea of this passage? We don't really know, do we? There's a lot of vocab we're missing here, and it's really hard for us to land on the main idea of this passage. Let's try again. I'm going to reread this. When she was 26, Eliza bought tickets to faraway Alaska. Few tourists had ever been there. Eliza wrote reports for the newspapers back home. She loved sharing the fascinating things she saw, such as huge glaciers, spouting whales, and the native people. Eliza even wrote a book, the first guidebook about Alaska. When Eliza went back to Washington, it wasn't long before she started thinking about traveling again. She decided to visit her older brother, who was working in Japan. Eliza sailed across the ocean. Now are you able to identify the main idea of this passage? I want you to pause for a second and reflect on how did your response change when I asked you to identify the main idea of this passage versus the previous passage? What role did vocabulary play in your response? On the first passage, the first two questions, what do you learn about Eliza and what's special about the book Eliza wrote? You were probably able to answer at least a little bit of both of those questions without the vocabulary filled in. And that's similar to what many of our students do. Our students have learned how to make sense of the words that they do know on the page and can skate by some of the time. But when we ask them to put it all together, for example, by identifying the main idea, that's when they struggle. The missing vocabulary is a huge barrier to our ability to understand what the passage is about. To take it back to the baseball study, if you don't know the baseball lingo of foul ball, bunt, pop-up, triple, a text about baseball will read like a foreign language to you, regardless of how good of a reader you are. You may be able to eventually infer what some of those things mean, but it will take you a lot more mental energy and time than it would for a reader who has that knowledge and vocabulary already. So we kind of went through this experience just to give us a sense of how it probably feels for our students who struggle with vocabulary, and to start getting us thinking about what are the implications for our reading instruction. So how do we help students overcome the vocabulary barrier? We build their knowledge through text. Nearly a century of research shows that vocabulary is the biggest factor in reading comprehension. Think back to the simple view of reading that we've covered in previous sessions. The number of words you can decode times the number of words you know, which is language comprehension, equals reading comprehension. A student's vocabulary has an exponential effect on what they can comprehend. Students on track for college and career are learning approximately 3,000 new vocabulary words each year. It's impossible to learn this many words through vocabulary exercises alone. You'd have to teach 16 academic words a day, every day of the school year. Luckily, knowledge and vocabulary are tightly linked, like two sides of the same coin. As a student builds knowledge, they're building vocabulary related to the topic they're reading about or learning about. And in so doing, they're exponentially expanding the number of words that they can comprehend. A landmark study in 1997 found that reading or listening to a series of texts on the same topic can yield as much as 4 times the vocabulary growth of direct instruction and reading disconnected texts. So why is there this link between knowledge and vocabulary? Because, as we mentioned before, knowledge is sticky. If you have an existing schema about a topic, knowledge and vocabulary is more likely to be easily processed and remembered. Remember, the stronger the web, or if you hate spiders, the more tape you have on a wall, the more likely it is that new words you encounter will catch and stick to it. When we try to learn vocabulary words in isolation, we just can't remember them for very long. They aren't committed to long-term memory storage. But we've found that vocabulary does stick when it's introduced as a part of existing schema. It goes back to brain science, just like in learning to read. When we learn a vocabulary word in isolation, the neural pathway for word recognition lights up, but the muscle there doesn't think it. This means it's not committed to long-term memory. But when we learn a vocabulary word that fits in with existing schema, the pathway lights up and the word is committed to long-term memory. One question that consistently comes up when we talk about building knowledge in this way is, what knowledge and vocabulary should we teach if we don't know what the passages on the standardized tests are going to ask? The answer to this question is that it would be impossible to teach every child every topic they would ever need to know about for a text they'll encounter on a standardized test or otherwise. But we can expose them to various topics across grade levels. In addition, at the end of the day, it's not entirely about the topics themselves. It's about the knowledge that they build and the Tier 2 vocabulary that transfers. Skills usually don't, but vocabulary can if taught in a way that it will stick by building schema. Here's why. When we talk about building students' vocabulary, we talk about 3 groups of words. Tier 1 words are the words of everyday speech, usually learned in the early grades, albeit not at the same rate by all children. They're not considered a challenge to the average native speaker, though English language learners of any age will have to attend carefully to them. While Tier 1 words are important, they are typically not the focus of instruction. Tier 3 words are specific to a domain or a field of study. Some examples include lava, legislature, circumference, aorta. These words are key to understanding a new concept within a text. Because of their specificity and close ties to content knowledge, Tier 3 words are far more common in informational texts than in literature. Recognized as new and quote-unquote hard words for most readers, particularly student readers, they're often explicitly defined by the author of a text, repeatedly used, and otherwise heavily scaffolded. For example, made part of a glossary. And in the middle here, we have Tier 2 words, which are a key area of focus for most literacy teachers. These academic words are far more likely to appear in written texts than in speech. They appear in all sorts of texts, informational, words such as relative, vary, formulate, specificity, and accumulate. They can show up in technical texts, for example, calibrate, itemize, periphery, and they can show up in literary texts, for example, misfortune, dignified, faltered, unabashedly. Tier 2 words often represent subtle or precise ways to say relatively simple things. Saunter instead of walk, for example. Because Tier 2 words are found across many types of texts, they're highly generalizable. So, while a student may not be exposed to the Tier 3 words that come up in, say, a comprehension passage on a standardized test, they are more likely to have had repeated exposures to Tier 2 words when they've built knowledge through text, nonfiction text in particular. For example, you may have read a text set about turtles, and maybe the passage on the test is about the African savanna. But students will still have picked up words like species and habitat that will help them understand this unfamiliar text a little bit better. And as we know, the more knowledge students build, the more likely those generalizable Tier 2 words will be committed to memory, as well as Tier 3 words that fit into their existing schema. Let's look back at our passage about Eliza from a few slides ago. I've taken the words that our students might not have known and categorized them. The blue words you see here are Tier 2 words, and the orange words are Tier 3 words. Skim the passage one more time, and think about if you knew the Tier 2 words, those in blue, but not the Tier 3 words, those in orange, would you be better equipped to understand the passage? Why or why not? What would you know and what would still be missing? The short answer is yes. While you might not know exactly where Eliza traveled or what she saw while she was there, if you don't understand the orange words, you would be able to understand that Eliza was a woman who loved to travel and wrote travel books. Definitely enough to help you move forward in your reading, and enough to explain the main idea. For the last part of this session, we're going to zoom in on the implications of all of this information on literacy instruction. What does this mean? What do we do? Before revealing some of the implications, I'd love for you to pause this video for a moment and just brainstorm a little bit on your own. What are the implications of what we know about knowledge and vocabulary on K2 literacy instruction? what might we need to do or shift in our literacy practices? Pause this video and think about that for a minute or two. So here are some of the implications. Expose students to complex content and ideas by not deprioritizing subjects like science and social studies, even in the youngest grades, starting in K2. We should leverage texts across disciplines to develop knowledge students can draw on. We should use text to deepen knowledge of a topic or theme within a unit of study rather than covering a broad variety of topics. So going deep rather than broad. And instead of starting with a standard and picking a text to quote unquote teach to that standard, we should shift our practice to starting with a complex text and using the standards in service of understanding the deeper meaning of that text or topic. In the next session in the Science of Reading series, you'll get to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of complex texts. Our earliest readers can be supported to comprehend this type of text, even if they cannot independently decode it yet. This gives kids important practice with how to grapple with increasingly difficult texts as they build their independence as readers. Also, it's important to note that text should be authentic. This is true for our bilingual ESL students as well. Students' read-alouds should be more difficult than what they can read on their own, and all students should access the same text to allow the opportunity to grapple with complex content. So how would this play out in the context of a specific lesson? How does it look different than what we may have seen previously in instruction? So let's take, for example, a second grade lesson on the Common Core Standard 2.5. Know and use various text features, captions, bold print, subheadings, glossaries, indexes, electronic menus, and icons to locate key facts or information in a text efficiently. No matter where you teach, you probably have a standard that looks and sounds similar to this one. Text features. Review the characteristics of two different types of lessons on this slide. On the left-hand side, we have how a skills-focused literacy classroom might address this particular standard. On the right side, we have how a knowledge-building literacy classroom might address teaching this standard. How does each of these lessons incorporate the standard? And which lesson do you think students would be more engaged in? In a knowledge-building approach, you're still aligning instruction to standards, but those standards are used in service of deep understanding of a text. I'm going to repeat that. In a knowledge-building literacy classroom, standards are used in service of deep understanding of a text. Kind of like rungs on a ladder, with the top of the ladder being key learnings about a topic. In knowledge-building classrooms, you'll likely see students and teachers engaging with multiple standards as they work toward understanding the text, rather than focused work on a single standard in isolation. Because the goal is to build student schema and knowledge, rather than rote practice with a skill. In the skills-focused classroom, on the other hand, we saw an example of leveled reading, which can create inequities by excluding students from the knowledge and vocabulary they need to become successful readers. And to the second question, how would engagement differ? Learning in a knowledge-building classroom is just fun. Just plain is more exciting and more fun. Little kiddos love to be experts, and we want to give them the opportunity to feel like they're the experts. So we've talked about a lot in this session. Let's take it back to Scarborough's rope. which we started with at the very beginning. Scarborough's rope reminds us that comprehension is the goal of reading, not word recognition. If we only focus on the green strands of Scarborough's rope without layering on any of the blue strands in K2, we're essentially asking our students to build constructs that they'll just have to break down and rebuild when they get to third grade. Adding on a knowledge building layer in third grade is harder than teaching reading holistically in grades K through 2, so that students are fluent readers when they get to third grade. The key idea here that I want you to walk away with is that knowledge building literacy classrooms more authentically mirror how we read and make meaning from what we read as fluent readers. This is a both and situation. We still need to teach kids the skills, and in some cases the strategies. We have to hit all parts of Bloom's. But spending all day, every day, on strategies without attention to building knowledge is a huge missed opportunity, especially for our students who enter school with less cultural knowledge. Dr. Timothy Shanahan says it well. If kids are going to spend the next 3 days reading and rereading a selection about Martin Luther King, or why empathy matters, or about children in Brazil, studying the vocabulary, answering the questions, practicing fluency, there is no excuse for them walking away from those lessons not knowing who the Reverend King was, what empathy means, or where Brazil is. Reading lessons need to have double outcomes: an improvement to reading ability and an increased knowledge about whatever was read. So we've covered a lot in this session today about knowledge and vocabulary. Take a minute to pause this video and really reflect on what you've learned. What is one key learning from this session that you will apply to your work starting tomorrow? And then what wonderings do you still have about building knowledge and vocabulary through text that you'll bring to a colleague or your coach or other literacy teachers at your school?
If your school or district is interested in direct support related to the content of this session, or if you have any questions, please contact TNTP by emailing maya.baker@tntp.org or christopher.henderson@tntp.org. You can also visit us online at tntp.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn.